historians aren't actually necessarily qualified to actually commemorate events, but we can tell you about how other people in the past have commemorated the same event. So I thought that would be something that we could contribute to this anniversary year. My name is Adam Rowe. I'm a professor of history here at New College. We have Casey Wheatland with us as well, a political scientist here at New College, and then a special guest, Miles Smith, who is a professor of history of the early Republic at Hillsdale College up in Michigan. So very excited to have him here as well. And we'll all give a brief talk, and then hopefully open it up for questions from you all and have a little bit of an exchange. So I guess I'll let you take the floor, Casey.
Wonderful, thank you, Adam. Well, I'm going to talk about one American and what he found in the Declaration of Independence and in the Revolution. And it's John Quincy Adams, who, of course, had some firsthand experience with the Revolution itself. He was a child at the time and became one of America's great leading early statesmen, one of our great diplomats. He served a long career in the Department of State. He became James Monroe's Secretary of State and later, afterwards, President of the United States himself. He was a New England Republican, formerly a member of the Federalist Party, and was the son of John Adams, our first Vice President and first President of the United States. On July 4th, 1821, John Quincy Adams is invited to give an oration on the floor of the House of Representatives. And this tradition of 4th of July orations was something that began very early on during the Revolutionary period, and was something that was recognized very quickly as one of the core civic traditions that could bind Americans together and could help to extol patriotism, encourage civic education, and celebrate and discuss important matters of state. This was, in fact, one of the founding mothers, Mercy Otis Warren, in her Magisterial History of the American Revolution, recommended this as a healthy way to encourage the young to know what is good about America. And so I'm going to talk about this 1821 July 4th this speech. And I think here John Quincy Adams' purpose is to show his fellow Americans that the principles of justice and the philosophical claims in the Declaration are consistent with their own political experience. By this time in 1821, the founders' understanding of social compact, of consent of the governed, of natural law, these things are already starting to be challenged. The founding generation itself is dying away. Washington, Hamilton, and Franklin were long dead. Jefferson and Madison and John Adams, JQA's own father, were retired. John Adams and Jefferson will both die a few years later. The new generation of politicians that's coming to the fore, they might have some knowledge and memory of the Revolution, but they would have been children at the time. And so firsthand memory and experience in the Revolution is quickly fading away. And at the same time, the United States itself is growing rapidly. You have what is called the era of good feelings, but the good feelings don't last very long. Right? At this time in 1821, the Missouri crisis of 1819, 1820 has just passed away. The Constitution and the question of the Constitution as a social compact is being threatened. You have secession movements that are beginning to emerge. In the War of 1812, the New England Federalists threatened secession. And so these are some of the challenges that far-sighted politicians like John Quincy Adams are responding to. So let me get into the actual text of the speech. In the introductory portion, John Quincy Adams talks about the origins of America. And he has little to say about the particular events or the dates leading up to the Declaration of Independence, or even about the men who wrote the Declaration. His goal, rather, is to lay out the moral and philosophical conditions that made the American nation possible. The British government, he says, had its origin in conquest. It was a portentous system of despotism and of superstition, but this had been done under the name of the meek and humble Jesus. And so there's a contradiction within English government, English civic life. And Adams traces a broad history of England leading up to the American Revolution. And it's a history of progress towards civil and religious liberty. These, he said, marched together and each produced martyrs within England. But the British only ever achieved partial victories in these realms, and did so at a steep price. JQA says, through long ages of civil war, the people of Britain had extorted from their tyrants not acknowledgments, but grants of right. In other words, the British could only get rights as a sort of something that the government is giving to them, right? It is never accepted fully in their system as something natural and inherent to human beings. JQA says that the British national character is itself intelligent and spirited, but it was impeded by their political and spiritual servitude. And there's a lesson here. Right? And JQA's lesson is that the people matter. Nations have distinct characters, but also the laws, principles, and institutions of your regime matter as well, right? Even if your people are intelligent and spirited like the British are, if they have improper institutions, if they don't have the right foundations for the government, they're not going to fulfill their greatest potential. The English, he says, made use of technological discoveries from other Europeans, namely the mariner's compass, gunpowder, and the printing press. And these works of the human mind were achieved in spite of the despotism that had existed in Europe. But these things, the compass, the gunpowder, the printing press, these all expanded knowledge of the external world. But JQA says that it was really knowledge of the internal world, knowledge of man's own nature, that was more important in the foundation and establishment of government. And here he turns to the Protestant Reformation. He says that this was an improvement in the science of man, an improvement in the intercourse of man with his creator, and in his acquaintance with himself. It was an advance in his duties and his rights. Now, what is it that the Protestant Reformation discovered? JQA says that it was a single, plain, and almost self-evident principle, that man has a right to the exercise of his own reason. Now, once this principle is asserted, it cannot remain confined to the religious realm. The discovery of religious reason, the discovery of religious liberty, the assertion of one's own reason in theological matters, leads naturally to the assertion of reason in political matters. Right? It leads to the belief in consent of the governed as the foundation for government, right? Human beings exercising their own reason in order to voluntarily form mutual associations together. And so the colonies emerge in this backdrop, right, where religious and political enlightenment are emerging. The colonies are forming charters with the kings, but we'll see this enlightenment was only partial. Man's self-knowledge, and by extension our religious and political liberty, stalled in England. The colonies were oppressed and their charters were violated. And this was the proximate cause of the revolution itself. And so JQA now in the center of his speech, he turns away from the origins of American government and he turns to the Declaration itself. He says that the Declaration shows us that justice is the end of government. It is its greatest moral principle. And justice is incompatible with the long-term colonial subjugation that the British imperial authorities had exercised. But he says it was inevitable that these colonies were going to have to become an independent nation. They could not remain under the servitude of Britain forever. The problem, though, with the sense of justice is that justice cannot only be this abstract thing. The reason that Britain cannot hold dominion over the colonies forever is that the rulers have to feel close to the ruled. They have to be in proximity to them. They have to know them. They have to understand them. They have to desire justice for them. And so JQA here speaks of what he calls two moral elements that bind society together. One is sympathy between members of the society, and the second is sympathy between the givers and the receivers of law. And he says that these sympathies begin with domestic life. They begin in the family, between husband and wife, parent and child, brother and sister. They spread through social and moral proximity to neighbors and to friends, and then all the way out more broadly to one's fellow citizens, to one's country, and ultimately to the globe itself. The problem, though, is that the British could not rule the colonies because these social and civic bonds of friendship could not be forged. Parliamentary authorities did not have affection or knowledge of the colonies. John Quincy Adams notes, though, the United States is not the first nation that had asserted its independence against an imperial government. We weren't the first to establish ourselves in this way. But what was distinct about our revolution is what the Declaration of itself embodies. It was this assertion of the universal and proper grounds of legitimate government, the consent of the governed, the unalienable sovereignty of the people. Conquest and servitude, the foundations of government in the old world, would no longer be the basis for rule. Now, as I said earlier, JQA wants to defend the political theory of the American founding against those who believe that social compact and natural law are mere abstractions. He's showing that government is rooted in our social and moral relations. Those who join into the compact are friends, families, and neighbors who agree on the principles of justice and on the need for mutual protection and association. The social compact formalizes these relations in a legal framework, laying out their respective rights and duties. And so the Declaration of Independence is not only giving us a just foundation for government, but a practical foundation for government. And so at the conclusion of his speech, John Quincy Adams asks, what has America done for the other nations of the world? And he answers that what we have done is we have shown a new and more perfect foundation for government itself. We have created an example for the rest of the world to follow. And here we get to what is the most famous part of this address. John Quincy Adams is going to turn to American foreign policy. He says, America in the Assembly of Nations, since her admission among them, has invariably, though often fruitlessly, held forth in them the hand of honest friendship, of equal freedom, of generous reciprocity. She has uniformly spoken among them, though often to heedless and often disdainful ears, the language of equal liberty, of equal justice, and of equal rights. She has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own. And so John Quincy Adams says what we have here is a model for just government amongst nations. And here we get to the most famous part of the speech. John Quincy Adams says, America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. Well, all right. If the United States has discovered these proper foundations for government, these universal foundations for government, the consent of the governed, in liberty of man and in natural rights and natural duties, then why would we keep that to ourselves? Why would we not wage war in order to promote liberty and independence for other nations? Well, John Quincy Adams' answer to this is that foreign policy is a potential source for regime change. He warns that even if we were to go to war for the sake of liberty and independence of other nations, if we were to enlist under banners other than our own, our spirit would change. He says that the fundamental maxims of our policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. We might become the dictatress of the world, but we would not be the rulers of our own spirit. Our own regime, our own principles, our own spirit would transform into something fundamentally different. We would begin to look more like the British themselves. We would change from consent to conquest. And John Quincy Adams concludes this speech with allusions to the British and the Roman empires. He quotes Virgil several times in his closing remarks, and he references scientific innovations that were made by British scientists. And his point here is to serve, Britain and Rome are going to serve as a foil to the United States. America's glory is not going to be that of Rome or Britain. It's not going to be the subjugation of the earth. Rather, it's going to be the perfection of moral and political principles. And so here's my theory of how this speech all fits together. I think what John Quincy Adams is ultimately trying to do here in 1821 is he's trying to shift the productive energy of America away from the temptation of imperial domination and towards cultural, scientific, and especially moral improvement. A great nation like the United States is inevitably going to be a major player on the world stage. And I think John Quincy Adams believes in golden ages. He believes that a nation like ours, one that's intelligent and spirited, is going to have the capacity to achieve grand civic, military, scientific, cultural, and philosophical endeavors. And these are not disconnected from each other, right? There is golden ages in which great men arise, great generals, great statesmen, great scientists, great philosophers. It's almost as if this energy somehow connects them together. But because of this, it means that America is going to be tempted to judge ourselves by the old standards of conquest and dominion, to attempt to seek domination as the British did, as the Romans did. Or perhaps even worse, we're going to assume that because we have this new foundation for politics, that our moral superiority gives us the right to intervene in the affairs of others and to oppose our will on them out of a sense of moral righteousness. And if this happens, America will squander its golden age. Therefore, John Quincy Adams, I think, is saying, citizens need to direct their energy instead to peaceful arts and to moral and civic improvement. So ultimately, how did John Quincy Adams find meaning in the Declaration? How did he find meaning in the Revolution? What he found in this is the most just and practical foundation for government, and a means to inspire his fellow citizens to pursue peaceful and civilized pursuits instead of self-destructive conquest. Thank you.
Terrific. So it is no small thing to announce the birth of a new nation, right? Conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And the founders themselves were acutely aware of themselves as of the historical significance of what they were doing. John Adams famously incorrectly predicted that July 2nd would be the day that Americans would recognize as the Day of Independence, because that's the day the Continental Congress voted for independence. And he didn't see why. I mean, that's the big deal for him, right? The mere PR statement announcing this fact, which was voted for on July 4th, he didn't quite see why that would be the big day. But he was correct in recognizing that the event itself, independence, as he wrote to his wife Abigail on July 3rd, that the day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival, It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with bonfires and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forevermore. Obviously, that is a tradition that has continued. And any anniversary celebration, by its very nature, is both acknowledging continuity and change, right? To commemorate an anniversary is to demonstrate the existence of an ongoing tradition, that something is continuing. But no two anniversaries can ever be the same, much the same way that no one can ever step into the same stream twice, right? Time is flowing in one direction. And one of the most important changes in how the revolution is understood and commemorated is the generational shift, right? From an event that people partook in to one that a succeeding generation, as Adams mentioned, he said this will be celebrated by succeeding generations. He also referred to our posterity in the same letter. And so one of the big changes that happens is that you have the emergence of a new generation of Americans who looks back at the founding as an inheritance, as opposed to an achievement, something they've inherited and have a duty to preserve. Drawing generational fault lines, right, is always kind of arbitrary and misleading in one sense, right? Because generations are they change gradually, not suddenly, right? But there is kind of a turning point that I think we can see, and it was helpfully pointed out to us by John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the last two surviving signers of the Declaration of Independence, the only two who served as president, who dropped dead on the same day, 50 years exactly after that historical event. So John Adams implicitly conceded the importance of July 4th by dying on that day, right? And at the same time, the literal son of Adams, of the founder, was in the White House. So this was a kind of a moment in which Americans recognized, okay, we're now on our own. The founding moment is past, and this is a new moment. And I think like it's a broad cohort, but basically to speak of the generation that was born after the Revolution and around the time of about the 1820s, that this is the distinguishing fact of them, is their perception of themselves as living in a post-heroic age, as living after the founding. And today we tend to think of these people as living in the antebellum era, right? Because that's what they presided over. But of course they couldn't think of themselves in that way because it hadn't happened yet. Yet they did, in one sense, it's true, because they did anticipate a war and a destruction of the Union that they were desperately trying to prevent. But so that their whole sense of themselves was as people who were living after the Revolution, after this great historical event, and the sort of the sense of piety towards the founding and a sense of referring back to that as for guidance and a sense of having to preserve that legacy is more intense and pervasive in that particular moment than at any other moment, I think, in our history. And I think there are three reasons for that. One, quite obviously, is that it's the American Revolution is the only event that binds that Americans have in common, right? A democratic nation requires and presupposes a national identity, but Americans had a sort of they had a colonial past, but those colonial pasts were different depending on which colony you belonged to. They had an English past, most of them did, but of course that was a different national existence, not an American one. And so, for instance, Alexis de Tocqueville. He identified the origins of America in the New England township, but that idea would have less appeal in Virginia and Georgia, as one can imagine. So the Revolution stands out as the only historical event that Americans had in common at that point, which is not true, obviously, once we have the Civil War, World War II, World War I, the moon landing, all kinds of things. These events vie in a kind of pantheon that at the time is the founding stands alone. And the second that I think is related is a sense among the post-revolutionary generation that this achievement was very fragile, that this could go away. I mean, I think today most of us take for granted that our nation will continue to exist after us. But in the 1820s, like it's not something that anyone could take for granted, right? Every single decade between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, there is a crisis that threatens a dissolution of the Union, right? So they are always thinking about that possibility. And that same recognition, the sense that this thing is extremely fragile, I think reinforces both their awe and gratitude for what the founders achieved in getting it together in the first place, right? And an awareness that if they had to go back to the Constitutional Convention and start it afresh, they wouldn't be able to do it, right? At least in the same way that it had been done before. So that reinforces this sense of awe for the founding generation. And so when we look at speeches commemorating this event, there is this kind of this sense of standing in the shadows of giants, right? So here's Daniel Webster in this vein. He says, "We can win no laurels in a war for independence." This is him commemorating the Bunker Hill monument in 1825, so the 50th anniversary of Bunker Hill. He says, "Earlier and worthier hands have gathered them all, nor are there places for us by the side of Solon and Alfred and the other founders of great states. Our fathers have filled them, but there remains to us the great duty of defense and preservation." Now note there the hint, the mixture of both admiration and envy, right, for the founding generation, a sense that this great moment has happened and can never be repeated, right? That you see there, and one could cite example after example of people making statements similar to this. But the most profound statement in this vein, the most profound meditation on this ambivalence towards the founders as both heroes that we want to emulate, but also of those that we cannot hope to emulate, is Abraham Lincoln in his Lyceum address, and as that he gave as a young man. And as Lincoln said, as Lincoln recognizes in that speech, the duty of preserving the inheritance of what the founders achieved is in some ways going to be more difficult than what they achieved, precisely because it is less glorious. That's what's going to make it. That's not the only thing that's going to make it more difficult, but that is one of the things that's going to make it more difficult to preserve this government. So, as he points out, he says the field of glory has been harvested and the crop already appropriated. But he goes on to say, there are going to be ambitious men, just like there was in the founders, in the founding era. And then the noblest ambitions, this desire for immortal fame, that was harnessed in the service of the revolution. But in the future, it's going to be a threat to what the founders had achieved, because people who want fame, as Lincoln says, the most ambitious souls, towering genius disdains a beaten path. It seeks recognition hitherto unexplored. It sees no distinction in adding story to story upon the monument of fame erected to the memory of others. It denies that it is glory enough to serve under any chief. It scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving free men. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have heard that particular speech before, that passage. No hands. Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, it's a quite striking, right, speech. And this is Lincoln was delivering this as a young man, and as the critic Edmund Wilson says, it almost seems as though he is warning Americans about himself, right? And I think without sort of psychoanalyzing Lincoln, I think you can say that the pathos with which he describes this ambition it suggests at least a familiarity with it. But I also think that he is quite sincere in saying that in his sense of his duty is to preserve what the founders have created, not to attempt to overthrow it. And you can see this by contrasting Lincoln's speech in the pathos with which he describes the duty of preservation with a kind of an alternative strain of American rhetoric at this time, which is criticizing Americans for the filial-pietistic attitude that Lincoln is celebrating here. So one wonderful statement of this is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote that our age is retrospective, Emerson complained. It builds sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generation beheld God and nature face to face. We through their eyes. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past? The sun shines for us also. So he's saying we should stop looking to the past and worshiping the past. We should make our own destiny, chart our own course, right? And one can see this as a kind of an alternative version of an attitude towards the founders, which is we need to unshackle ourselves, unburden ourselves by this past. And one of the most interesting speeches in this vein is by Charles Sumner, who was asked to deliver the 4th of July commemoration at Faneuil Hall in 1845. This was kind of an annual occasion in Boston that they selected someone who was a young and promising citizen to deliver this oration, and it's meant as a kind of a patriotic celebration of the founding. But Sumner was not content to eulogize the founding, so he used this occasion to denounce that very attitude. And he says, "To glory in past achievements without adding to them," Sumner said, "is the height of imbecility. To each generation is committed its peculiar task," right? It sounds like Kennedy there. Sumner in this address identified the abolition of war as the great achievement that needed to be that the Americans should attempt to obtain. And he says, so instead of eulogizing the martial heroism of the founders, he basically condemns them for their barbarism, basically, which is, you can imagine the surprise of his audience, where he says, for instance, quote, "There could be no peace that is not honorable," Sumner declared. "There could be no war that is not dishonorable." Right, so he's castigating war itself, and this is kind of Sumner's brand of taking a moral position to its very extreme. Since war is bad, all war is bad, right? And one amusing side note here is that obviously after the Civil War, which Sumner supported when he published his collected works, he subtly changed these sentences from declaratory sentences into question marks. So it became, can there be any war that is not dishonorable? Can there be any peace that is not honorable? So question mark. So I mean, obviously a little subtle change there. But here you see, right, a kind of a different attitude towards the founders, which is that there's a tension between the Lincoln attitude and the Sumner attitude, which is that it is hard to emulate a revolutionary generation and also preserve the legacy that they bequeath to us, right? And that's a tension that I think we wrestle with to this day. And just to conclude, I wanted to mention. A little bit about the most famous words in the Declaration, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The emphasis on that, although the Declaration itself becomes kind of a sacred text, starting in the 18 teens and then in the 1820s, but the emphasis on the most important words of the Declaration, that doesn't really happen until the 1850s with people like Lincoln and the other Republicans. For example, Alexis de Tocqueville, in his 2-volume study of democracy in America, which is all about the Americans' ability to reconcile democracy with their desire for equality, or liberty with their desire for equality, he never mentions the Declaration of Independence once, these sentences, which would seem like a very strange omission if it had the central place those sentences had in that they have in our culture today. And so why is it that all of a sudden these words become so sacred? It's because people began to deny them, right? That's what not just Lincoln, but many other Republicans began to see, is that people began to, so long as Americans took for granted this principle of theirs, that all men are created equal, and that the Constitution was an attempt to embody this principle in a frame of government. One didn't need to assert it as a foundational creed. But as Americans begin to deny that creed, that's when it becomes all important. So as the Republican platform of 1860 says, quote, that the maintenance of the principles promulgated in the Declaration of Independence and embodied in the federal Constitution, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, is essential to the preservation of our Republican institutions, and that the federal Constitution, the rights of the states, and the union of the states must and shall be preserved. So I wanted to highlight 2 points about this particular use of the Declaration. The first is that it jettisons the famous beginning. We hold these truths to be self-evident, right? It doesn't include the quotation of that part, and in part that's because, in major part that's because these truths were not at the moment self-evident. There were people who were flatly denying it. They were saying, no, the races are in fact different, that there is a race that is meant to be a master race and a slave race. So Americans were not, these were no longer self-evident scientific principles. It had become, and this is the way that Lincoln converts it in his Gettysburg Address, it had become a proposition. So a self-evident truth is true whether people believe it or not, right? 2 + 2 is 4. Doesn't matter whether, no nation would be dedicated to the proposition that 2 + 2 = 4. For Lincoln and for other Republicans, the truth of the proposition, all men are created equal, is contingent on the capacity of men to govern themselves. If they can govern themselves, then they are in fact equal. If they can't, then this proposition fails, right? And then the other part of this that I think is important is that the platform, despite editing the document, does continue after the part that, after the pursuit of happiness, which is where memory starts to fade when we quote the Declaration of Independence. It continues, right, to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that part is also important, right? Because Lincoln and the Republicans are distinguishing themselves from two different positions. One is the denial of the American creed, which is that all men are created equal. The other is a rejection of the American political institutions as an inadequate manifestation of that creed. That because of provisions that allow for the recapture of fugitive slaves and things like that these things should be just torn up and torn asunder. So what Lincoln is doing there is he is willing to concede a lot to human imperfection and human weakness to maintain both the creed and institutions that imperfectly embody that creed. But if there is a rejection of the creed itself, I mean, he's willing to basically risk the destruction of the government rather than retreat even an inch from the basic principle that all men are created equal. And I think there's a reminder there that like the sense that our republic is fragile is a source of its preservation, right? Plato wrote in the Laws, quote, let's see where there is, he says, the beginning is like a god, which, as long as it dwells among men, saves all things, right? He wrote. So to have a regard for the beginning is to ensure that it persists. Thank you.
Well, so I want to thank Dr. Rowe and Dr. Wheatland for having me. It's great to be with you guys. To begin, I have to ask a question. How many of you have seen the movie The Patriot? Patriot. So I like it. It's fun. Mel Gibson, starring as Mel Gibson, starring as Mel Gibson, starring as a Patriot soldier. And so the end of the Patriot is the Battle of Cowpens. It's a big American victory, sort of near the end of the war at the beginning of 1781. And if you, it's about an hour from where I grew up in South Carolina. And so if you go there, and believe it or not, I'm going to talk about 1776. If you go there, you find out something interesting about the Revolutionary Army that was camped there, the Patriot Army. The fires for that army were on the perimeter of the encampment, not in the center of it. Why? What? Yeah, so maybe to keep people out. It was to keep something out. It wasn't people, though. The wolves. Yeah. There were gray wolves in the Carolinas during the American Revolution. So why am I talking about wolves? Well, I think to sort of think about 1776, we have to ask, like, why, what's the fundamental reason? What's almost sort of the sub-political, what's this almost sort of natural animal reason why people are shooting each other over this stuff, right? Why take out a gun and point it at someone who looks, and at that point even sounds kind of like you? If you've ever seen the Harry Potter movies and you know how Hagrid sounds, that's sort of how Thomas Jefferson would have sounded. The Virginians had a pronounced, it's called a West Country accent. So they're a lot alike. Britons and Americans are a lot alike. So what makes them different, right? What makes them actually picking up their guns and killing people? And why the hell am I talking about wolves? Well, you have to sort of think about the space a little bit. North America, 1776. What's it like? I'll use where I'm from in North Carolina example. It's a climatological analog at the time of Southeast China. It's got bamboo. It looks more subtropical than what we think of today. So the space looks very different. The animals, the megafauna is different. There's wolves, there's elk. If you go a little bit further west into what's now West Virginia, even the part of Western Virginia that John Denver's actually singing about, sorry, you West Virginia people, it's actually about the real Virginia. There's buffalo still, bison. And those aren't plains bison, they're called wood bison. There's one relic population of them in Alberta today. They're about 25% bigger than the buffalo you see on TV. So they're the size of a pickup truck. And so you're an English-speaking person living in a place that is wild. We actually know roughly how many people are living. There's under 3 million Anglos in all of what's called pre-Iberian, meaning above Iberian North America. So if you get draw a border somewhere in Coahuila or Sonora and across Mexico, and above that, there's 3 million white people. We probably know there's about 400,000 First Peoples in Canada, Native Americans here in North America, in what's now the United States. So the sum total of humans on that continent above modern Mexico is probably about 3 million people. So to give you an idea, that means every single human above Mexico in 1776 North America could have fit into the Tampa metro. Think about how many people thrown across that space. There's nobody there you're at a place you don't even recognize. If you come from England at the same time, the population of Great Britain is between probably somewhere on the order of 8 to 10 million people, depending on how you count it. And so that's about the population of modern Georgia, fit into an area about the size of modern Georgia. It's a relatively populated place. North America is nothing like that. So why are these North Americans breaking off? Like, what's making them actually sort of get angry? Well, they conceive of themselves as something other than English, but they're not so different from the island of Great Britain. And so the document I have is the Causes and Necessities. It's the original July 4th, except it's on July 6th, and it was in 1775. So I'm going to read a paragraph to you, so bear with me. It was written by Thomas Jefferson and John Dixon, guys who had sort of relatively different approaches to politics at the end of the day. They're pretty different fellows. So this is what they wrote. Our forefathers, the inhabitants of the island of Great Britain, left their native land to seek on these shores a residence for civil and religious freedom. At the expense of their blood, at the hazard of their fortunes, without the least charge to the country from which they removed, by unceasing labor and an unconquerable spirit, they effected settlements in the distant and inhospitable wilds of America, then filled with numerous and warlike nations of barbarians. He's overplaying that. Virginia wasn't particularly settled by that many Native Americans, but parts of Pennsylvania and North Carolina were. Societies or governments, vested with perfect legislatures, were formed under charters from the crown, and a harmonious discourse was established between the colonies and the kingdoms from which they derived their origin. The mutual benefits of this union became in short time so extraordinary as to excite astonishment. In that entire paragraph, one word doesn't exist: England. They're not viewing it, we've heard this sort of rights of Englishmen story. They're not viewing themselves as Englishmen properly. They think they're Americans. They've always thought they're Americans. That part's not new. So what do they think of themselves as? Well, when do the people get over here? When do the Puritans and Pilgrims come? Remember what day? They're the news. We Virginians were there first. But like, we'll start the country. We'll sort of let John Quincy Adams have his day. Start the country with the Puritans. What year is that? 1620, right? That's the Mayflower. And so the story of America is a pretty old one, even by 1776. They've been there 150 years, right? That's a pretty long time. Generations upon generations have lived there. And they never thought of themselves as mere Englishmen. From the moment they get there, they're Americans. And they're pretty comfortable with the idea that they're Americans. But they don't see themselves as entirely different from the mother country, right? The United Kingdom, Great Britain. So what do they think of themselves as? Well, in 1620, how many kingdoms are there on the island of Great Britain? Or then we might ask, in the British Isles total. If you lump in Ireland, there's 3. So there's England, Scotland, and Ireland. Wales is part of England, technically. Don't tell the Welsh that. So what these Americans do is they kind of think they're a 4th kingdom. We're this 4th kingdom that exists under the British crown. And so we've kind of created our own sort of kingdom over here through these various colonial assemblies. They don't view themselves as one nation. They wouldn't have used that word. But they think of themselves as having a political existence that is at once united because of space and geography, of experience. They've all had to hack out the civilization out of a wilderness. And they also know they share allegiance to the king. That's what they share, this allegiance to the king. They don't think for a minute they are subjects of the English and then later British Parliament. They have their own parliament in the colonial assemblies. They've never been subjects to the British Parliament. They wouldn't have imagined themselves as being English parliamentary subjects. They've always been Americans. But they do see themselves as tied to the crown. They're loyal. If you go back and read the Causes and Necessities, they're fawning in their language to the king. trying to be as respectful as possible. They love the king. They have these protestations of their adoration for him. And mind you, what I just read to you is after Lexington and Concord. The shooting's begun. The killing and dying, it's all going on. And yet they're saying, we love the king. This is not a battle against the king. It's a battle against Parliament. So what are they taking up arms for? What are these Americans who've hacked this civilization out of this wilderness actually fighting over? They're fighting a bureaucratic revolution that's occurred in Great Britain. Imagine, if you will, you have never been run by a group of people for your entire life, right? You're Floridians. You live in Florida. You have the Florida Assembly. Now imagine the United States Congress says, no, sorry, we're getting rid of the government of Florida and you'll be ruled directly by Congress. Right? Not going to make you really thrilled, especially if you know how Congress does anything. Right? You're not going to be excited about that. Now take that and make that Congress one that is actively going to revolutionize your commerce, your laws, everything. So let's just take judges for an example. If you were in North America and you had some sort of civil case, it almost always was done through your local assembly. That was where you did court. They wouldn't have seen it as courts like we see it today, but that's where a lot of the legal stuff happened. Now, you're going to have to go across the ocean to Great Britain for some of those same cases. The same economic things is going to happen. You used to be able to do things right in your own local market. This is what radicalizes George Washington, by the way. They say, no, you can't sell things locally. You have to send it back over to London and have it go through a factor before you sell it to another colony. So think about how that works out if you're George Washington and you live in Fairfax County, Virginia, or Westmoreland County, Virginia was where his other place was, and you want to sell tobacco to Maryland. If you're at Mount Vernon, anybody been to Mount Vernon? What, you look north across the river, what do you see? Maryland. And so George Washington, it would have been technically smuggling for him to get in a boat, row across the river, sell his tobacco in Annapolis or Savannah, wherever he wanted to go to, and then come back and sort of cash out in Virginia. And so what's interesting is by 1776, 90% of English business or of North American businessmen are technically smugglers. You are a legal smuggler most of the time if you're in business. Not because you're like, you got, what's Pirates of the Caribbean, and you decide you want to get into that, right? Because the laws changed above you, and now you're actually a smuggler. And this is just a small scale thing. Over and over and over again, this is the story in the 1760s. This is what happens. And the colonists, they're not revolutionaries. They're saying, hey, you guys have changed all the rules in a decade. This is nuts. And Parliament knows they're doing it. One of the things they do is they set up a second Admiralty Court. There was one Admiralty Court historically, it's about 5 miles east of London in Greenwich. You can see the big white building still there. And so guess what? They're not enforcing all the customs rules, right? Just like the speed limit. How many of you drive over the speed limit? I do, right? I mean, how many of you are like just sitting there hanging on 69 to 70 in the 70 mile? You're not doing that. You're a normal person. You have somewhere to be. You're not worried about it. That's a lot of the laws that are sort of basically what we would call imperial laws about commerce in North America. No one's worried about it, right? They don't enforce it. Relax. In 1768, Parliament decides to put a second Admiralty Court in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Why? Because they're saying, hey, these colonies, they haven't been following the rules. We're going to stick it to them. There's a new principal in town. You're going to have to follow these rules. But they don't put it in any of the 13 colonies they know are rebellious. And there's a specific reason why it's those 13 that rebel. Because there's, at any given point, between 18 and 26 colonies in North America. So we should ask why those 13. So they put it in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Has anybody ever been to Halifax, Nova Scotia? Yeah, is Halifax a pretty place? It's lovely. Yeah. What was in Halifax? Why is that Admiralty Court there? Halifax was a military fortress. And so it's in Halifax and not Boston or Philadelphia because they don't want it put anywhere where the Americans can influence it. It's meant to be the military sticking it to these 13 particular colonies. And those 13 particular colonies are bound by two things. One, geography. And second, they all have to sail the same way. So guess what? If you're getting caught in the same traffic stop, or even worse, right, the same speed trap, how many of you ever talked to people friends like, oh, there's a speed trap? Does that make you angry? Yeah, it makes me angry too. Those 13 colonies, they're all angry about the same speed trap. And it's not merely a speed trap, right? You're getting thrown in jail if you do this stuff. So there's a spatial element to sort of the American Revolution. And so it's like, why is it these groups of people at this time in this place? It's because they're responding to these really specific things. And I think we've kind of undersold the realness of that. Like, I love the ideas of the American Revolution, freedom and all that good stuff. But there's very few things that make me madder than hell than getting a speeding ticket, right? And just up the ante on something like a speeding ticket. Think about if you were living in a place that was aggressive about COVID, how you felt about the rules. Think about that kind of very visceral government invasion of your life. And so that's what's driving the American Revolution. Specific things in a specific time in a specific place. And I think as you think about the revolution, and you think about the legacy of the revolution, we might ask, okay, how do we deal with the things we think about are infuriating to us in our own specific time and specific places? And that's where the ideas come in. That's where the ideas get important. Because there's things they do that they really think are transcendent. They're like, this is timeless, and you're going to encounter the same thing someday. It's going to annoy the shit out of you, and you got to figure out, how do you deal with those things in your time and place? Here's some ideas to think about. Now go be good Americans. And so I think that's one of the things I've thought about more and more is it's not merely the ideas, right? But there's these very specific things in a specific time, in a specific place, and you're having to work that out. You, real people in real time, in real place, with real families and real kids, are having to work that out, right? The revolutionaries are normal people. They're not demigods. Their dads, their sons, the women who are involved, their mothers and wives and sisters, they're all real people, right? There's not like a special sort of like magic patriot dust that got sprinkled on them that allowed them to figure all this stuff out. They're real people responding to this real stuff. So I think the realness of the revolution has become so much more tangible to me as I've read more about it, as I've read more about their experiences. So I'll be quiet now.
Also, I want to open up to you all for questions first.
I would have a question for Mr. Wheatland.
Of course you do, Paul.
So, you told us that John Quincy Adams, in his speech, wants to tell us that the US is not going to go into conquest for liberty into other nations because it wouldn't make them better than Britain themselves. So I assume, however, if the US should be attacked from outside, it has the right to defend the liberty of itself. So my question then is, how can liberty preserve itself in still allowing the danger to deliberize itself by itself? If we now, for example, look to Hungary, Viktor Orban got into power by public vote, by liberal vote, and he did a few major things to deliberize the whole country. He changed the constitution in favor of his party. He got in power of the total media, so kind of propaganda. So how can liberty preserve itself against itself?
I think if I understand your question right, what you're pointing to is that within the Declaration of Independence itself, within the understanding of government that you have in the time of the founding, there's a tension. there's a tension between the formation of government and the purpose of government. Right? You see this in the Declaration, right? That you begin that second paragraph, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, right? So there's the purpose of government, right? Secure those rights, right? Secure that liberty. But it says, deriving its just power from the consent of the governed. And so, what if the people don't want liberty? Right? What if the people want an illiberal democracy, for example? Well, for one thing, if it actually protects their life, liberty, and property, then it's not illiberal. It's fulfilling those purposes. But there's a tension there that can never be, I think, easily resolved. But I'll give you an example of thinking about this in terms of foreign policy, because you mentioned the ending of John Quincy Adams' speech. When James Monroe is in office and John Quincy Adams is serving as Secretary of State, you have revolutions taking place across the world. You have revolutions in Latin America against the Spanish Empire. You have a revolution in Greece against the Ottoman Empire. And the Greek Revolution especially was very inspiring for Americans, right? Because they look at Greece as the birthplace of Western civilization, the birthplace in some ways of some of these principles of government. And a lot of Americans are saying, well, why don't we go help the Greeks? After all, there's a sort of kinship between us. Well, the response from James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, and this is actually going to be part of the formation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is a term that's applied to James Monroe's 7th Annual Message to Congress in 1823. They're going to say, well, look, we're well-wishers of liberty. We hope the Greeks win. But if we go about trying to solve their own problems for them, it's not going to be good for us. They have to be able to resolve it themselves. They're going to have to be able to assert their own spirit of liberty. And if they do that, then they prove that they have the capacity to really govern themselves. We simply cannot do it for them. Even if we have the physical materials to do it, even if we have the manpower to do it, we cannot do it without endangering ourselves and without actually abrogating the whole purpose of government. Because the purpose of government is the protection of liberty and rights, but it's the protection of the rights of those people who are forming that compact. And so we cannot use the resources of America to help some other nation abroad. We are contradicting our own contract there. And so all that is to say is that there's not an easy answer to your question. It requires a certain moral and civilizational formation of the people themselves, so that they actually want and desire that liberty.
I have a follow-up question for what you just said. So you were essentially saying they didn't believe in America using its resources to go solve other nations' problems throughout the world because there's an obligation for the American people? So I guess
that's right.
They wouldn't believe in America being the moral police at all, or the world police.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The American foreign policy itself, if you're looking at the broad scope of its history, really up until the 1890s of the Spanish-American War. Before that time, America is an insulary power, meaning that we do not want to get involved in the affairs of other continents, other hemispheres, other sovereign nations, especially Europe, which is our great rivals at that time, right? These European empires and the European nations. The idea there, and this is reflected in the Monroe Doctrine, which I think is useful to talk about in light of the Declaration of Independence, is it's often misunderstood. Right? What James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, as Secretary of State, who was an architect of much of this, what they really wanted in the Monroe Doctrine, right, this is responding to this practical problem that these new republics are being founded in Latin America in rebellion against Spain. How are we going to interact in that situation? Who are we going to recognize as sovereign? Are we going to recognize the Spanish imperial authorities or these new Latin American countries? And Monroe's answer is, we're going to recognize the de facto sovereignty of whoever's in power, whether it's the Spanish or it's the new Latin American countries. And there's two principles behind this. One is the moral principle that you get in the Declaration of Independence itself, right? That if you look at the first paragraph, it says that we're asserting a separate and equal station among the nations of the world. Right, so there's this principle of national sovereignty. It actually comes back around at the end of the Declaration. Right? When everyone reads the Declaration, they're focused on individual rights in the second paragraph. Those individual rights are actually sandwiched by an assertion of national sovereignty at both the beginning and the end of the document. So that's the moral principle, is that nations have a right to sovereignty, that we're going to recognize the sovereignty of whoever is in charge. The second part of the Monroe Doctrine, though, is a more strategic principle. in that Monroe warns the European states, don't try to reassert empire in North America, because if you do, we're going to perceive that as a potential threat to us, because you're going to establish these monarchical regimes that are contrary to our republic, and you might try to subvert the republic. And that was a sort of recognition of the general, international relations principle that great powers have spheres of influence, right? We want to keep other great powers out of our back door. So the idea there is we're not going to go to war in favor of independence in Latin America. We're not going to protect them, but we are going to make mutually beneficial assurances and alliances if it's absolutely necessary to protect American citizens. And that was the general tenor of American foreign policy for the first 125 years of American existence.
I'll add just one point to that, which is that when you're looking at the diplomatic and foreign policy history of the United States and its relations with other countries in the early republic, one difficult problem that people have, one thing that's hard to get your head around, is just how insignificant the United States seemed to European powers at this time. So that as Miles was saying, like the United States is like, it's basically like an empty wilderness by comparison to European countries. And so, like even in the Monroe Doctrine, there's a bit here of like, we were saying leave us alone, but it was and we'll leave you alone. Mm-hmm. Of course, the Europeans like there was no real chance of us meddling in their affairs to any significant extent, right? We were kind of a junior partner, so we were then asserting a kind of a delicate independence from European powers, whereas. So the huge, and to give you just an example of this, right? Like the GDP of what is today Haiti, Saint-Domingue, was equivalent to the GDP of all the North American colonies. So when the French are asked whether they want their North American empire or their Caribbean empire after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, they choose their Caribbean empire, right? Because that's much more important to them. So that's, I guess in thinking about American international relations, it's one of these things that's we are the same country as we were then, but in terms of our geopolitical weight, right, there is just a massive change over the last 2 centuries.
I'll jump into one of the things. Cinco de Mayo was yesterday, right? And so why would I bring Cinco de Mayo? Well, yeah, Cinco de Mayo is not Mexico's birthday, and Cinco de Mayo is actually a wonderful national holiday because it's about winning a battle against France, and it's always fun to beat up France. Cinco de Mayo is the National Army of Mexico, the small L liberal National Army beat an invading French Imperial Army in Pueblo in May 5th, 1862. And what's interesting is that was really important for the United States because in the 1860s, there's this real sense that the empires are striking back. Europe invades Mexico. Spain, Britain, and France invade Mexico in 1861. And so why is the Union Army, anybody seen the Ken Burns Civil War special? And there's a letter by this guy named Sullivan Ballou. And Sullivan Ballou, who is from Rhode Island, right? No, there's nothing wrong with Rhode Island. Like South Carolina not being a part of America doesn't change your life in Rhode Island. It doesn't make your life any different in Indiana. So why the heck go fight? Like, why is secession a problem? It's because when Abraham Lincoln says something like last best hope, and Sullivan Ballou says something like free government depends on this war, they really think that the Confederacy is a fifth column for European monarchies. They are convinced that the Confederacy is a bunch of neo-European medievalists who, the minute they get a chance, will join up and help Europe fight back and impose, if not monarchy, then some sort of aristocratic government on North America. And what's interesting is the Confederacy sort of gets a chance to show their colors. In 1863, Napoleon III, who's Napoleon's nephew, convinces the brother of the Austrian emperor to become the new emperor of a New Mexico. And he's looking around for friends, and who's the first group of people who say, hey, we'd love to be your friend? It's the Confederacy. And what's funny is people think of the Confederacy as being the American South and deeply Protestant, but what message does Jefferson Davis, who'd been educated as a Catholic, send to Mexico, to the new sort of traditionalist Catholic monarchical Mexican empire? He says, oh yeah, we love Catholics. And so what does he do? He appoints a Catholic priest as the poet laureate of the Confederacy. He makes sure that PGT Beauregard, a French-speaking Catholic, is made a 5-star, what would be the equivalent of a 5-star general. And so guess what? The Confederacy, which is mostly Protestant, they sell out. They basically say, hey, all you traditionalist European countries who want to reimpose all that stuff, we're your guy. And so it's an immediacy to the Civil War that we don't really see, that everybody in the North, if you were sort of really devoted to Republican liberty, small r Republican liberty, you were convinced that this was the last moment. This is it. If we fall, everything will go back to the way it was. And that's why there's guys from Rhode Island marching through South Carolina.
Okay, it looks like we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming.
Join us in falling in love with America again.